We're going to look at the Compromise of 1850, which is very important in the lead up to the Civil War. It's a very, very controversial compromise that was put about. So let's look at it here. Compromise of 1850 coincidentally happens in the year 1850. It does five things here. Texas gives up some of the land that it had claimed. Texas had claimed vast land out west. But in return for Texas giving up claims to some of that westward land, the federal government is going to take on their debts to relieve Texas of a very, very large debt that it had built up. Number two is California is going to enter the country from being a territory into statehood. And it's going to enter in as a free state. This is seen as actually a pretty big victory for the North because the South had assumed, and they even tried to say, well, below the 35th parallel, California should be split. There should be a slave state in the southern part of California. Although, technically it's the Southwest, but here's a state certainly in the southern half of their country, which will now be a free state. So this is actually seen as a big win for the North. And not just that, but there had always been tensions between the North and the South over control of the Senate. Now remember the House of Representatives, which is based on population. The North had controlled that for a while now because of having a higher population, especially with more immigration moving into the North for the factories and manufacturing. But the Senate had always been balanced. You might remember the famous Missouri Compromise that Henry Clay also helped broker. In the Missouri Compromise, you look back to 1820 and you look and you see Missouri come into the nation as a slave state, and Maine come in as a free state to keep the balance 50-50. Likewise, when Arkansas comes into the nation as a slave state, they hurry up and have Michigan come into the nation as a free state. And there had been this balance for a long time. And so for the first time in a long time, the free states now have an actual advantage in the Senate. There's one more free state, California, than slave states now represented in the Senate. So now free states technically hold an advantage not just in the House, but a slight advantage now in the Senate. So this is a pretty big victory for the northern states. Number three is New Mexico territories and the Utah territories. They're going to have popular sovereignty. The people living there will get to choose to vote. And back then, the New Mexico territory included basically modern-day Arizona and New Mexico for the most part, and the Utah territory roughly comprised of modern-day Utah and Nevada. So these are bigger areas. And one thing to note about this right here, now the Compromise of 1850, with this right here, New Mexico and Utah territories having popular sovereignty, is undoing for sure what had been done arguably here with the Missouri Compromise. Because the Missouri Compromise, remember, said, we're going to have that 3630 line, and there's going to be no slavery permitted south of that. Now we have new land that wasn't around at the time of the Missouri Compromise, but now you can have for sure the potential of slavery with popular sovereignty well north of that line with the Utah territory. So this is possibly a victory for the South in terms of the compromise. However, this area is very arid. There's not a lot of fertile soil, so it's not as if slavery would have ever taken a strong hold here, most likely. But then again, you never know, maybe some mines and things like that. But most historians look at that and say slavery probably would have never really taken hold in this land where you just can't really farm back then, at least very well with high significance. The fourth thing that it does is it bans the slave trade in D.C. Now you can still own slaves legally in D.C. and you can still live in D.C. and own slaves. You just can't buy or sell slaves. A lot of people on both sides of the issue, pro-slavery Southern people and abolitionists in the North, they felt that it was kind of ridiculous that foreign dignitaries traveling to our country could see slave trades happening, slave families getting broken up in these deals. Just a horrific, painful sight of seeing families getting broken up, parents separated from kids, husbands and wife getting separated. And they decided, and supposedly you could even see some of the slave trades going on from the Capitol steps. And most people agreed this is not what we want to be showing our country, for our country, so they banned the slave trade. So in theory, remember, D.C. is a small area. In theory, you can travel short distance.
Olivia Kuhn to the main office, please. Olivia Kuhn to the main office.
You can still travel a short distance to Maryland or short distance to Virginia, and then buy or sell slaves where it's legal, and then bring them back to D.C. So this really isn't a victory for North or South. This is both sides see it as something that they want. And the fifth thing here is a tougher Fugitive Slave Act, and this is considered as a big victory for the South. In fact, the Compromise of 1850 really helps exacerbate the problems between the North and the South. The North really resents this tougher Fugitive Slave Act. There's stories of, essentially, you are now a criminal if you help or try to assist a runaway slave, pointing him to the direction of Canada, giving him a place to stay, giving him food. At the same time, slave catchers can go northward anywhere, all the way up to Michigan, grab people, drag them away, accusing them of slaves. The courts now have been moved out of the localities to a federal place farther away. The judges get paid twice as much to determine that the person's a runaway slave as opposed to a free person. There are some examples of slave catchers grabbing people and falsely accusing them of being a runaway slave so that the slave catcher can bring them back down south and make a profit off of the sale of the supposed slave. So the tougher Fugitive Slave Act is highly controversial. The North sees it as invasive upon their rights, as invasive upon their even Christian values, because a lot of Northern preachers, or at least some of them, are starting to preach, that lessons from the Bible would show that you would help or assist runaway slaves, or let them in on a cold winter night, and the Fugitive Slave Act is making that a crime. Well, now that we know what the Compromise of 1850, now we know what it did, well, who helped create it? Henry Clay, the great compromiser, who also came up with the Missouri Compromise. He's also known for the American system and all that. He helps come up with the strategy to make the compromise, and Stephen Douglas helps broker it in the Senate and breaks it apart into different chunks and has it passed. And Stephen Douglas, the famous Democrat, this is the famous Democrat who debates Lincoln in the Lincoln-Douglas debates. What are some of the effects? Well, some people say, what it really did was delay possibly the Civil War for 10 years. Now, this is obviously debatable, but some people say, without this Compromise of 1850, we very well might have had a Civil War previously and at this time. And it fixes the problems just enough for 10 years, but then the problems are just too bad, and then we do devolve and have a Civil War. But some people say it actually delays the Civil War. And the people who do say that usually tend to point out that actually helped the North. Because during this 10 years, during the 1850s, it's a boom time for the North. The North is growing, their manufacturing is growing, the railroads are growing, and the South is growing too, but not at quite the same rate. The North is able to grow its advantages over the South. One thing I think is important to think back to when we look at the Compromise of 1850 is the Mexican-American War. Mexican-American War, remember, we get all of this land. We get California, what would become the Utah Territory, the New Mexico Territory, from Mexico. And at the end of the war, one of the problems of the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848, is it opens up this can of worms between the North and the South. Will this land be open to slavery, or will it be excluded? Will it be, white men with white labor, free labor? And so David Wilmot, out of Pennsylvania, he had been in a variety of parties. He had been a Democrat, he had been a Free Soiler, and eventually a Republican. He says, if the Mexican-American War truly isn't a land grab to grab more slave land, to help out the slave states, create new slave states and things like that, then let's pass this Wilmot Proviso, which will ban slavery in all of the land that we acquire from Mexico in the Mexican-American War. This does not pass. The South blocks it in the Senate, and it does not pass. But the Compromise of 1850, remember, Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848. It's no coincidence that by 1850 we have to deal with a lot of the problems that this new land is giving in terms of when we turn these territories, these newly acquired territories, into states. Are they going to be slave states? Are they going to be free states? So the Mexican-American War really grows the tensions between the North and South and leads to the Compromise of 1850. So that's the Compromise of 1850. Very important in the lead up to the U.S. Civil War.